Hi, welcome to Constitutional Chats, hosted by me, Janine Turner,
and Cathy Gillespie,
with students
Dakare, Chatman,
and me, Tova, Kaplan.
Join us as we discuss hot topic issues with constitutional experts. It's sponsored by Constituting America. Welcome to Constitutional Chats, hosted by me, Janine Turner. I'm the founder and co-president of Constituting America, and Cathy Gillespie, co-president of Constituting America, where Cathy and I, along with Constituting America's student ambassadors, Dakare, Chatman, and Tova Kaplan, we discuss hot topic issues with our constitutional expert. And today's hot topic is the coronavirus and the Constitution. How does it affect religion, liberty, election accessibility, and movement? How does the Constitution play into all of these elements? It's going to be a great, great segment. And our constitutional expert is Professor Knipprath. So welcome. Okay, I'm going to tell you a little bit about everybody. I'm an actress by trade. I'm also the founder and co-president of Constituting America. You can go to JanineTurner.com to find out about all the other things I do. You can go to constitutingamerica.org to find out everything we do at Constituting America. Multi-tiered. We have scholarship programs. We have contests. We have trips with the kids. Oh my goodness. We have the George Washington Speaking Initiative, where we go into your schools. I've given over 500 some odd speeches into schools. We have our 90-day study, which is happening right now for educational purposes. We are multi-tiered, so please visit constitutingamerica.org or JanineTurner.com. So that's enough about me, or as we say in Hollywood, enough about me. Let's talk about you. What do you think about me? Good. Isn't that funny? Is everybody laughing? Okay, Dakare is laughing. He's an actor. Okay, he gets it. That's a joke, but it's how, egocentric. Okay, Cathy Gillespie. Raise your hand. Cathy is a co-president of Constituting America. Hello. And one of the 16 private citizens serving on the U.S. Semi-Quincentennial Commission. And she's helping organize the celebration of our country's 250th birthday in 2026. That's only 6 years away. Everybody say semi-quincentennial. So that's Cathy. I like to say that Cathy and I are co-presidents. It takes a right wing and a left wing to fly. And if it were not for Cathy, I would just be flapping around.
That is,
and I would not do. It is. We would not be off the air. We would not be flying without Cathy. Tova Love Kaplan. Tova is 16 years old and lives in Illinois. She currently serves as Constituting America's National Youth Director, and which she does fabulously. She's a 3-time winner of the We the Future contest. She won Right Brain, Left Brain in the entrepreneurial category, where she created a marketing plan. She won PSA, which is like a little commercial, which is entitled Know Your Rights, Read the Constitution. And she also won with STEM, where she created an app. So we are very impressed with Tova Kaplan, Tova Love Kaplan. She is passionate about educating and empowering young people to use their constitutional rights. She is a whiz kid. Thank you so much for being with us.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us.
Okay, and Dakare Chatman. Dakare Chatman is our Constituting America student ambassador. He is 16 years old. He won Constituting America's We the Future contest once for public service announcement, which is truly terrific, just like Tova's, where he reminds viewers that the Constitution is an American thing, so know it. And he's currently up on billboards for Constituting America across the country. He also won for his Man on the Street, which is a short film. He goes out and interviews people on the street in a really cool plaid coat, I might add. Looks very 60s and hip and cool. You can see that at constitutingamerica.org. He is also actively involved in our National Youth Advisory Board. And he's a working actor, most recently seen on HBO's The Righteous Gemstones on Netflix. You can see that now, right, Dakare? Is that out now? Or no? When is that coming out?
It came out last Wednesday. Outer Banks.
The Righteous Gemstones did?
No, The Righteous Gemstones came out in August of last year.
Oh, okay. So you can go see that, Righteous Gemstones. And Netflix Outer Banks is just out this week. There's a very cool picture of Dakare on set. We actors love those pictures. That's so Netflix, you can go see that right now, called Outer Banks. Dakare wishes to be an actor, but also a politician. And he thinks in order to be a politician, you really need to be an actor. Right, Dakare? Say hi.
Absolutely. Hello, everyone. Thanks for being here. Y'all are phenomenal people.
Okay, now last but certainly not least, we are such big fans of our constitutional expert. And our constitutional expert today is Professor Joerg Knipprath. He teaches constitutional law, legal history, jurisprudence, and various business law courses at Southwestern Law School in Los Angeles. He's the faculty advisor to the Federalist Society and the Christian Legal Society at Southwestern. He is one of Constituting America's constitutional scholars and has been writing essays for our 90-day study since our first year in 2010. We have known Professor Knipprath for over 10 years. He absolutely rocks. Y'all are going to have so much fun today. Professor Knipprath has written more essays for Constituting America than any other essayist has written for Constituting America. He's written over 116 essays for us throughout our 10 90-day studies. So he's written lots of amazing books. He's just so cool. He is married to Michelle Knipprath and is the proud father of 7 children. So our constitutional expert, Professor Knipprath, say hello.
Hey, everybody. Thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure.
It's really fun for us because we're big fans of Professor Knipprath. So I haven't actually seen you since, I guess you were a mentor and speaker once it was in Malibu. You were there. Correct. And the other time it was Universal Studios. So Correct. It's been a few years since I've seen you.
Yeah, time passes quickly though.
I know it does. Well, okay, so now we're going to start asking questions so we can learn about the Constitution, because Professor Knipprath is the constitutional expert. How does this affect, what are the parameters of the Constitution on religious liberty, election accessibility, and movement? So my first question for you, Professor Knipprath, since I kind of put this all together and I get the first question. It's like being the first to do the Scrabble pieces, and I'm lucky. My question to you is this. I watch all the press conferences with the president, which I encourage everyone to do because they are long, but they're fascinating. It's a really great example of how the government is working with the private sector, how the military is coming in, all these people the medical, the experts, and all the way that they have worked so hard, and how the government is working in this, pegging this area and this area and this area. I think it's a great study to watch those press conferences and how the government works. I encourage y'all to watch them. But Professor Knipprath, okay, we've all learned through this process, and especially if you've watched the press conferences and what we read and learn about this pandemic, that there is a separation of balances between the federal power and the state's power, in the respect that all of the states, their governors have been in charge of the shelters in place, when they can come out, what they can do. Some have been much more intense than others. I'm sure we will discuss this today. Some are, like Governor Abbott's, very hands-off, whereas other governors have said you can't buy tomato seeds and you can't buy paint. I mean, or you can't go in your private boat. So it's really interesting to watch the dichotomy of how the governors are handling this. But everybody wants to know this question. Everyone, one day they say, we want the president to make everyone shelter in place. He is not being strong enough. He's letting everyone get sick. The president needs to say everyone should shelter in place. And the next day, when the president says something a little bit like that, all the governors say, no, the president can't tell us what to do. So here is my question. He did come out the other day, a few days ago, and said, I could do this. And everyone's like, no, you can't, no, you can't. And then the next day he said, the governors are going to do it. The governors are going to do it. So here's my question. Is there a scenario where the president could have the federal power to overtake the complete operation over the states, over the governors. He could have, because he said one day he did have that, and everyone's like, no, you didn't, no, you didn't. But I'm thinking there might be an example of how a president could take over the whole situation, where I'm thinking that might come into play, but you're the expert, so I can't wait to hear what you say, is if like a military invasion. If we had a military invasion of some sort, then the president could obviously take over everything, because that's what the Constitution says about military and protecting the country. Could he not use that angle to then say, I'm taking over this entire thing? In other words, does he truly have that right if it were positioned in such a way?
Okay, well, that's a multi-layered question. I think the president actually got it exactly right, that there are a lot of things that he can do. Whether or not he will do them, whether that's the best path forward, is not necessarily the same thing as what is constitutionally permissible. Some years back, Justice Felix Frankfurter, writing an opinion for the Supreme Court, pointed out that much of what the Constitution says about executive power, it really leaves it in the hands of the particular individual how to exercise that, the particular occupant of the White House. Now, as to your particular question, I would suggest that you think about this in various layers. What does the Constitution expressly allow the president to do? What can he infer from past practices as part of his constitutional powers? And what has Congress authorized him, either directly or indirectly, to do that he might not be on solid constitutional grounds without such authorization? The scenario you suggested, that is a military invasion, of course, the Constitution expressly allows the president to act there. During the Civil War, another, which was not necessarily a military invasion, but presents the same kind of issue of a violent conflict, the president, Abraham Lincoln, took it upon himself through various implied powers that he claimed, including simply the oath to protect the Constitution, to act unilaterally in dealing with that military emergency. We're not at that stage, and I think it would be difficult for the president to argue that since there's no violence, there's no insurrection, anything like that, that he can take over on that basis. That said, there's certainly a lot of potentially statutory authorization that he can use and has used, including the power once he declares it's declared a national emergency under the Emergency Act, that gives him then presumably implied powers to act for the benefit of the country, potentially in a far-reaching manner. So I would look at congressional authorizations. He already has that in the context of various statutes, such as what was used to prioritize production by American companies of needed medical equipment under the Defense Production Act. And there are other statutes of that ilk that would allow the president considerable control over economic aspects. Beyond that, I think you have to rely on the Emergencies Act and then his inherent powers as chief executive to allow him to act in the way that President Trump suggested he could.
So what was the first of all, explain to our younger listeners what the word statutory means.
Statutory is by an act of Congress, a law that Congress passes, which authorizes the president to do something, rather than looking at the text of the Constitution directly and getting that power. The president does have the power to deal with insurrections and war directly under the Constitution as commander-in-chief and as head of the militia, as it were.
But if I were to ask you a yes or no question, if he wanted to take over this entire thing and tell everyone to stay in place in your house, or everyone now is free and can come out, he yes could do that or no could do that? And if it's a yes, it would be under one of these statutory laws that you were just mentioning. I didn't catch the first one.
Yes, given that this is not a military situation, and given the fact that the president is not dealing with violence, where he could suspend the writ of habeas corpus, and at least according to what President Lincoln did under those circumstances, the president would more likely rely on statutory authority and build on that, what Congress has allowed him to do regarding the declaration of an emergency, of a national emergency, and then proceed with his own constitutional powers. He's the chief executive under what's called the executive power clause of the Constitution, that he could then do what he believes is necessary to deal with that emergency. Again, that's simply from what is potentially available as a constitutional matter. A completely different issue is whether or not that is politically palatable to the American people, whether that is effective, but it is potentially there. So now one of the things that I want to throw a caution in here is that in the military emergency, for example, during the Civil War, when President Lincoln acted to suspend the writ of habeas corpus, he focused on those areas where there was a problem of violence and insurrection. So the same token, it might be different whether the president would constrain himself to areas that are particularly affected by the coronavirus versus the nation as a whole. So I think it would be constitutionally more palatable if he focuses then, whether it's under the emergency statute or something analogous to what Lincoln did regarding the habeas corpus act, or the habeas corpus decision, that he would focus in on the areas that are most affected by this.
Okay, really, really fascinating. So I think what you said, if I'm to surmise, is that yes, he could take over the whole country under a statutory, meaning a law made in Congress, under the declaration of emergency. I guess that he could, because he stood up there and said, "Oh yes, I can." They're like, "Oh no, you can't." So I was really curious if he really could. It wouldn't really be the right thing to do. It wouldn't be politically palatable, but it is within his power to do that if he wanted to.
As the law is right now, he would be pushing it if it was extended nationally, as I said, rather than focusing on those areas most affected, because simply looking at the practice about how the president's powers have been used in the past, they've typically focused on particular problems when they are using extraordinary measures. That said, if it can be determined to be a truly national emergency, the president does have potentially those national powers to, so he's right in the theoretical sense as to what might be possible. But,
well, see, and I'm going to move on and go ahead. I'm sorry.
But we have to remember one thing, though. The Constitution and statutes are written in a certain way. That it isn't always 100% clear. There's a lot of flexibility built in. And a lot is going to depend upon what I tell my students is the small c Constitution, not the written document, but how people actually habitually have acted, both on the political side and what the people of the United States have traditionally been willing to accept. So there is this more informal constitution with a small c, custom, if you want to call it that, that governs a lot of what is acceptable. And sometimes presidents may push the boundaries.
So same thing with Supreme Court decisions, really. Kind of, there is an influence of what the people want, don't want. But I just wanted to know black and white if he actually could. And then because people get confused, they don't know the Constitution, so it's everyone's guessing. So we know. Thank you. That was wonderful. Okay, so I guess I'll go to Tova next. Tova?
Right, so thank you. So we've seen a lot in the news lately about the tension between the federal government and the states. So I was wondering, how do you think the COVID-19 outbreak could fundamentally change the relationship between the federal government and the states, and what grounding is that in the Constitution?
Okay, I'm not sure that there's going to be a fundamental change between the national government and the states. There has long been a trend to centralize much more of American politics than there was, say, 100 years ago, even at the time of that Spanish flu. Other than during wartime, we were a much more federal country. So there's been a long-term trend towards centralization. What is fascinating to me, and this relates to some of the remarks Janine made in the beginning, how a lot of people are rediscovering principles of federalism that one might not have expected to have thought about those things before this epidemic. But it's traditionally been the case that in these kinds of things, the governors and other local officials have taken the lead in deciding whether or not something is to be shut down. To what extent there's going to be a quarantine. Doesn't mean the federal government can't get involved, but it's traditionally been handled by local authorities, going all the way back to situations where, some ship might come into port from an area that had had an epidemic, and now the local authorities are quarantining that ship. I don't know that there's going to be a major, once this dissipates, as it eventually will, a major change in the federal-state relationship. It might be healthy, though, that people are reminded that the best way to govern a society as diverse as ours and as geographically large as ours is by, under these principles of federalism that the framers established, that I think much of which we had kind of forgotten over the years. That what Louis Brandeis years ago referred to as the laboratory of the states, that we deal with that. It also reflects best democratic government, that which is closest to us. We are best able to influence. It takes account of all the diverse circumstances. New York City is not the same as Bozeman, Montana. I'm personally very pleased to see that there is this at least temporary rebirth of federalism.
Yeah, I think I agree with you, Professor Knipprath, that suddenly people are understanding why they don't want a centralized government to take over everything, because people are so unique and different in their states, and you really are seeing Wyoming is having a very different reaction than New York City. And so it's been really interesting to me that don't you think they probably, and I'm gonna go to Cathy now to ask a question, but they have a renowned appreciation now of the states, the power of the states, and why, like you were just saying, why local government really, really does matter. Because I think Americans are just sort of federal government, big government, but one size fits all doesn't really work in so many circumstances. I think the pandemic has brought this to light. Cathy, what's your question?
Well, I was going to follow up with Tova's question, in keeping with the focus on the states, and in thinking about the 14th Amendment, which I'm pretty sure said that the Bill of Rights had to be applied to the states, or the states had to recognize the Bill of Rights. How are the states able to basically put a hold on some of our rights under the First Amendment, and especially religious liberty, whether it's states or mayors, and how far can they go? Because I noticed a court case where in Kentucky, a congregation had wanted to worship in their cars, and the mayor had said even that wasn't allowed. But then they took it to court, and the judge said, no, actually, that's okay. They can worship in their cars. So could you talk a little bit about that, the whole religious liberty issue, and states having to respect the Bill of Rights, and how they can decide to take away some of these rights temporarily?
Sure. As you said, almost the whole, not entire, but almost the whole of the first 8 amendments in the Bill of Rights have been, what we say, incorporated into the 14th Amendment and applied to the states. So the end result being they do, as you say, apply to the states. As far as the free exercise of religion, that's really what we're concerned about here. There are 2 religion clauses in the First Amendment, the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. And what's at issue here is the Free Exercise Clause. Now the Supreme Court has, and this is a somewhat complex issue, and depends to some extent on exactly what the restrictions are that the state has imposed on the gathering of the faithful. The general position that the Supreme Court has taken is that if you have a statute that doesn't target religious institutions or religious practices as such, is just a general rule, a general law, even if it has some effect on the free exercise of religion, that's most likely going to be constitutional. So if you have, for example, a ruling that says, or law rather, that says when you're out in public around others, you have to maintain a distance of 6 foot distance between two participants, two people at all times, okay? Then they could certainly say that in church, if you're going to gather, you have to maintain 6 foot separation between you and any other congregant. What they can't do is target religious practices. So if they said, well, look, for example, you were giving an example of the people that were worshiping their cars, I believe, at least that was one of the examples. So if they say, well, you know what, you can go to the fast food restaurant and you can sit in your car and hang out there and eat your meal, but you can't sit in the church parking lot in your car and listen to the sermon being broadcast. Now we're getting problems into potential constitutional problems because the law is not being applied the same. The argument the state might make is that, well, one is essential, that is the food, the other is non-essential. Then you would get some real pushback on, what do you mean religion is not essential? This is one of the big topics at the time of the founding. You know, they were very much concerned. There were lots of debates going on in the states at the time about freedom of religion. And you have all kinds of folks over these generations, from presidents to Supreme Court justices to other prominent individuals, talking about the importance of religion in American life. It depends upon how the state crafts the restriction on religious liberty.
That's helpful.
Okay, so a follow-up question I have for that are two things. One, I was looking up the 14th Amendment, which would be good to actually explain what that is. But one is, when can the president then step in over the states, or can he or she someday, step in and say, you are not being fair, by not letting people buy tomato seeds, or not letting them go to, they take it to the courts? Is that what they did? Because Cathy was saying they took it to the courts. I mean, if they're not, can the president step in and say, wait a minute, you can't take away people's religious liberty? But my other question is, they're making some of these things so vague. In other words, they're saying, we recommend you wear a mask. I don't know of any state that has made it a law that you have to wear a mask. And yet they yanked that guy off the bus that everybody saw. I mean, he didn't have a mask on, and 10 policemen came and just physically pulled that guy off the train or whatever it was, because he didn't have a mask on. So those two different questions. But can the president have any say if the states are? I think that's really kind of what question Cathy was asking too, because of the 14th Amendment, which is federal. So you can't do this in this state. When can the president override the governor in like these unfair situations? And then if they're not actually laws that you have to wear a mask, did that guy have the right to be on that train without a mask?
Okay, I don't know exactly which states or communities have made some of these mask wearing requirements mandatory versus merely suggestive. Obviously, if it's merely exhortatory, suggestive, then there's no reason to enforce them. There's no basis for state authority to enforce it. It's merely recommended. That's not the same thing as requiring it. So the law would have to be clear that, as you said, it's vague. They would have to require it. As far as the question that you mentioned about whether the president can step in and override these decisions by the by the governors, I think that gets into some unknown territory. Under the 14th Amendment, there is a section in the 14th Amendment, the last one, Section 5, which gives Congress the power to make laws that would prevent state violations of the 14th Amendment. So Congress could step in and pass a law that says no state shall, require or shall prohibit churches from meeting. It's a very broad statement here, but no state shall prohibit churches from meeting or religious organizations from meeting. That would have to be a congressional law, and then the president can enforce that to the extent that state laws conflict with that. But the president, I am not sure, could simply on his own step in and say, look, the states have to let these churches meet. I think that would be the issue of whether or not this is fair by the states or even constitutionally permitted. That gets, without congressional authorization or legislation, I think gets into some difficult territory for the president.
So the president essentially can't do that, I guess, unless it's under a declared state of emergency, which we were discussing earlier, which would be a broad.
Right. Once it's a declared state of emergency, well, maybe you have to go beyond that even. Once there is a declared state of emergency, depends upon what Congress has authorized him under the emergency statute to do and whether he can connect it to dealing with the emergency. Okay, and usually that's going to have to do with like economic situations or problems of that sort. When there is a declaration or the president suspends the writ of habeas corpus, either on his own as Lincoln did or through action by Congress, or when a governor declares martial law within the state, now all bets are off as far as constitutional rights are concerned. But that hasn't happened. There has been, that last drastic step hasn't been taken, and a declaration of emergency is not the same as a suspension of the writ of habeas corpus, which can only come under certain circumstances, or a declaration of martial law. We're not dealing with that right now.
The declaration of emergency, though, that comes from the executive branch, correct?
It comes from an authorization by a statute of Congress.
So Congress declares the state of emergency?
Congress authorized the president to declare state of emergency.
Okay, so Congress authorizes the president to declare a state of emergency in a,
Right.
in a law, a form of law.
That law is about 40 years old.
Okay, it's 40 years old. So when he declares the law, though, it's the executive branch who makes up what's inside that law, the stipulations within.
Correct.
Okay. All right, Dakare.
Yes, sir. Thank you for being here. I had some questions that I'd already wrote for you. So mine is kind of veering a little bit off, but it's still on topic. So I'm guessing that we were already in violation of the Constitution when we started the whole stay-at-home quarantine thing, because we can't physically force people to stay in their house. But furthermore, if the stay-at-home order is unconstitutional, could United States citizens sue the U.S. government for losses incurred?
Okay, the last part of the question I couldn't quite hear, but I think I got the gist of it. So the assumption you've said is that, look, the stay-at-home order orders are themselves unconstitutional. Let me start by saying that if this were some kind of a declaration of martial law, suspension of the writ of habeas corpus, if it were at the federal level, declaration of martial law, or some other kind of exigent circumstances at the state or local level, absolutely you can tell people to stay home. The government can tell people to stay home. A lesser version of that is to impose a curfew during certain hours where people cannot go out of their houses. There's a history of doing that when there are riots and that sort of thing. So one could perhaps extend that in comparable types of emergencies. But let's assume that an actual stay-at-home order were not constitutional. Then could people go and sue, and I think you said for economic damages? Is that what you said? Could sue the federal government or maybe more relevantly, the state governments for economic damages. I'm not going to get into there's a technical barrier which is perhaps a little bit more too complex here, called the sovereign immunity doctrine, which does prevent lots of kinds of lawsuits against government without their consent, at least for money damages. So now, assuming that's not a barrier, then you could certainly try to recover economic damages from that if you can establish the relevant or the required causation. It would be possible to do that, at least in theory. But that's a lot of ifs. So
a lot of ifs. So to sum that up, though, even though we have all these rights in our Bill of Rights and in the amendments and the Constitution protects in all the various ways, if a local government tells you to stay in your house, they have the right to do that. What gives them? Tell me again. What gives them the right to do that? Either the states.
If it's a state, for example, again, there's something the states have called the general police power, which is to make any laws necessary for the health, safety, welfare, or morals of the community. And that power is, the scope of that power, how it's exercised, is primarily dependent upon what the people are willing to accept politically. As far as a constitutional matter, only those restrictions out of the US Constitution or the state constitution would restrict the police power of the states. And I guess I should add any congressional laws that override the state power to do so. But the states do have broad powers to deal with diseases. They do have broad powers to deal with these kinds of community-wide emergencies. Now, are there limitations to that? Again, as I keep coming back to, it depends upon the scope of the emergency. If we're dealing with violence, riots, and some kind of declaration of exceptional circumstances, declaration of martial law, when the state has power to keep people at home, you can't go out, for example, to demonstrate against the government under those circumstances. Something short of that, which is where we are right now, there are still constitutional restrictions, right? And so that brings up what you said earlier, Janine, the right of movement, and it brings up the issue also of the First Amendment, the right to petition, to assemble, to petition the government for redress of grievances. And you still retain those constitutional rights, especially as far as the First Amendment right to assemble, to petition the government for redress of grievances. You cannot be kept out of the streets that way. Everything else is a little bit more ambiguous. Right? Can you gather? Do you have a right to gather for social gatherings in the street? Do you have a right to go to do shopping, or could the government shut that down and you can only do deliveries? Right? A lot of this is going to depend upon the nature of the emergency. The courts are very flexible about these things.
So what? I'm going to go to Tova now. This question, and we want to get to the election accessibility too. So are you saying that the states have the right to say shelter in place because of this crisis? You have to shelter in place. But then where does the Constitution trump that? And that even if you're telling us to stay in place, we have the right to assemble. So where I think, unless I just didn't connect, where does that, I mean, you're seeing that happen in Michigan, right? She's saying stay at home, and they're out and about. So at what point does a person have the right to say, well, the state has told me to stay home, but I have my rights in the federal government under the Bill of Rights? Wait, can that
Yes, it can. It depends upon the situation. If you're dealing with the concern about violence and insurrection and riots, the state can put itself on record. The state authorities as, okay, we're going to declare a martial law. We're going to send in the National Guard to patrol this because this is how bad this is. Then you can tell people to stay at home. Absolutely. Does
the Constitution trump that? Can they come out and say, I have my First Amendment right?
Once you have those kinds of exigent circumstances, the Constitution is made for ordinary times as a practical matter. Okay? Historically, state governments have had the power to basically declare these kinds of exigent circumstances and keep people in their houses when there are dangers of riots and violence. So at
that point, you cannot claim your First Amendment right from the Constitution because the state has told you to stay.
Correct.
So the state is trumping the federal government at that point.
Well, it's not a question of state trumping the federal government. There are two governments. They could both do it, but the state presumably would only do it within its contours.
Okay, so if I'm told to stay home, it's an emergency, and the state has said you must shelter in place, I cannot then go out and say I have a First Amendment right.
That's not what I said. I said when the state goes out and declares a military or not a military, an exceptional state, such as through martial law, sending in the National Guard. That's quite different from saying, look, there's this virus out there, shelter in place. It depends upon what the nature of the emergency is. The courts are not going to apply it once,
Okay, let's say we're being attacked and I have to stay. The one that you say is the most severe. At that point, if we're being attacked, it's the most severe case. I am told to stay in my home. I cannot then claim my First Amendment rights.
Correct.
So it depends on the state.
There's plenty of history to that. Just as there's, if the federal government did it through a suspension of the writ of habeas corpus, which is effectively the same thing as a declaration of martial law, then they can suspend your First Amendment rights. There are plenty of cases about that. Not a problem.
Well, okay. So we'll move on from this, but I think it's interesting to figure out who makes that decision. What is the most severe? Is the military is it a military invasion that severe, or is the plague that severe? So I think that someone has to make that decision about what's the most severe, that then your First Amendment right, you don't have anymore. Anyway, let's move on. Tova, go ahead.
Right. So at Constituting America, we're all about trying to empower people to use their constitutional rights to stand up for themselves. So, and I've noticed a lot of the comments are people kind of wondering what's constitutional, what's not, and worrying that their constitutional rights might be overtaken. So if somebody were to feel that their constitutional rights were being taken advantage of, what avenues does the Constitution provide for us to be able to stand up for ourselves and get that visited?
Okay, let's take the example of protesters that have appeared in a number of states, which is a good example. My view would be that this not being a military violence situation, riots and so on and so forth, no formal suspension of writ of habeas corpus, no declaration of martial law, nothing like that. That even stay-at-home orders would be overridden by at least your right to participate in protests, which is most directly what's at the core of the First Amendment and the Assembly Clause, to petition the government for redress of grievances. That doesn't mean even there that your right is absolute, because anytime there's a gathering, even for political purposes, the government can impose certain rules. Even in ordinary times, they can require you not to block the streets. They can require you to keep moving, not to block entrances to buildings. There are all kinds of what are called time, place, manner restrictions that the government can impose. So with the demonstrations, Americans' protests still retain that right. This is not one of those historical circumstances where that's been overridden. But the state could certainly impose reasonable restrictions. You've got to keep 6 feet apart. You've got to wear masks, right? Assuming you can talk, this doesn't prevent your ability to make your views known. If they impose those kinds of restrictions on anybody who's outside, right? So Americans can exercise those constitutional rights by testing the state that way. Now, if they get arrested, then this is the time-honored way, that you test the constitutionality of something that the government has done. The other way is for groups who want to protest to go to court in anticipation of what they think the government is going to do. If they have some basis in believing that the government's going to try to shut them down because they're violating this order, they can go to court and get an injunction against the enforcement of such orders against them for purposes of this parade. So these are legal processes, some after you violate the order and if the state decides to prosecute you. The other is to try to do this in anticipation that the state is going to enforce this against you. Right. So the second route, the difficulty is that it takes time, and you don't get your views out necessarily in the time that you need.
Yeah, they didn't arrest those people in Michigan that weren't 6 feet apart. That's interesting. Okay, Cathy, yes, and we probably only have 10 minutes. Probably should get on to the election aspect.
That's what I was going to suggest. If we could move on to the elections issue, and we had someone who wrote in and said, how will this pandemic impact our communities when it comes to traditional voting at polls? Will this mean the adoption of vote by mail? And if so, how can constituents with disabilities like visual impairments exercise their right to vote? And I thought if you could just start by explaining what the Constitution says as far as who is in charge of scheduling elections in our country, and then who has the authority to change the dates of elections.
Okay, the primary authority for setting the dates for elections are the states. And we're talking here about the general elections. I'm going to come back to things like primaries, but the general elections, it's up to the states initially. But what happened early on was that the states set dates for selection of presidential electors. And in those days, oftentimes the state legislatures did this themselves. They selected the electors. This occurred over several months, depending upon where you were. So by the time, the last states decided how to select their electors during the Adams-Jefferson election, it was already pretty clear that Adams was going to lose. That variability of election laws then led Congress to step in and to pass a law that set the times for the elections or the date of selection of electors, when those electoral votes would be counted, and when, if there was no majority, the House of Representatives or the Senate would act. Here I'm talking about general elections in the federal system. So for president, senator, US representative. As far as setting dates of elections for governors, state legislators, mayors, county executives, whatever they might be, that's up to the states over their own internal control, okay? Primary elections as well. This is a decision of the states, not of the federal government, even in elections for federal officials, for senators and so on and so forth. That's up to the states to do. Why is it up to the states to do? Because a primary election is a selection process, a kind of nominating process. And the nominating process has not always been done by primary elections. It can be done by convention, it can be done by caucuses. So that's really an arrangement between the states and the political parties. So much of this then is under the control of the states as to what kind of voting they will permit, when the dates for elections are. The exception to that is for elections for federal officer. There the Congress can step in, and as it has done, and set the times for the elections to take place.
We've seen this happen with the primaries. Certain states have continued their primaries and certain states have pushed their primaries. So I think we've seen that happen. Dakare, do you have a question?
Yes, ma'am. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
So on voting, nobody knows how long the virus is going to last because we haven't been given a set date. And we've heard June, we've heard July. I mean, my uncle's an infectious disease doctor and he's told me December. So who knows? And if the virus runs into the presidential election, how are we going to make this safe? Are paper ballots an option? And with voter ID, how is this going to play out? If paper ballots are an option, how are we going to vet that people who are actually eligible to vote are voting?
Yeah, all those are mechanics that to some extent exist whether this virus is around or not. But you are quite right in saying that the virus perhaps exacerbates the issue of, what kind of voting should be permitted, should the elections be postponed. I don't know that without action from the state legislatures under state law or the Congress in the federal situation, that elections can be postponed. I don't think that works very well for the governors or the president simply to declare this on his own. That goes so close to the very heart of Republican self-government, Republican with a small r, Republican self-government, that I think it would call into question the legitimacy of what the president or the governor would be doing without legislative authorization. So as far as the process itself, I think what you mentioned is a problem all the time. It's worse, it seems to me, with mail-in voting. As far as trying to deal with whether or not the election process is honest. So how do you deal with the paper ballots if you do that? Probably the way that we try to deal with social distancing generally. Just going to the grocery store, you got the X's as people, marked 6 feet apart where people have to stand in line to vote. You only let so many people come into the place at once, into the voting hall at once, and then disinfect all the time. I don't know what else to say.
Professor Knipprath, if you're saying that like they probably do it like grocery stores, I go shopping for my grandmother and those lines are extremely long. Would this hinder people from going out to vote?
It might, or the state might have to set up more polling stations.
They voted forever. If you had to stay 6 feet apart, it would just take so long.
Yeah, you'd probably be a mile down the road, right? Lined up.
Yeah, it would just take forever. Can you mentioned this, the president and the Congress, and it's really fascinating to hear you speak and talk about all the different checks and balances and whatnot. But just for clarity's sake, because everyone says the president's going to push the election and he's a dictator or whatever. Can the president? You just said this. I'm sorry if I don't get things the first time. But can the president push the election?
I think that would be into very much uncharted constitutional territory. It's one thing to suspend certain liberties. It's quite another to suspend the process upon which the very legitimacy of the government rests. When this wasn't done during the Civil War, and the elections could proceed during the Civil War, I just don't see constitutional custom supporting the president. I don't see anything specifically in the Constitution supporting the president doing that. I think it goes too far as far as the bedrock of self-government without congressional authorization.
So the president doesn't really not constitutionally have the right. I don't see it anywhere in the Constitution to delay an election.
I don't believe so. And I don't believe, frankly, that, and again, I don't know all the state constitutions, maybe some of them allow it, but I don't believe that state governors have that authority either without legislative authorization. And this is not a situation where it's of such a dire immediacy and emergency that we cannot get the legislature to participate in the process. Right? This is not a sudden nuclear attack where the president's got to act. Congress not around, or the governor has to act without the legislature. We have plenty of time to prepare for this, in other words.
So it goes back to what you were talking about earlier when we were talking about, you know, the extremity of what is creating the shelter in place. If we're being attacked by a foreign country, it's very different than what we're dealing with now. So it's interesting, this sort of the gray areas of interpreting these things. And I think that's what makes it so confusing for everybody. You know, it's the law is there, but it depends on sort of the situation that's making us enact the law. Okay, so yeah. All right, so Kathy, I see your hand up. We have 1 minute. This has been fascinating, Miss Professor Knipprath. You're so great. This has been great.
I think Dakare had his hand up. I don't think my hand was up.
Oh, I was just looking at your face because I can read your face. We have 1 minute, Dakare.
Yeah, so I just wanted to ask another question. So actually the governor of South Carolina, Governor McMaster, has today marked the day that he opened up all retail in South Carolina. All retail stores are open now. So my question is, if the entire federal government decided, or every state decided they were going to open back up retail, would this hurt our economy more than it would help it? Because people just wouldn't want to go out and spend money because they're just too scared?
I don't know. Your evaluation of that is going to be as good as mine, because it's really not a constitutional issue. It's a very down-to-earth practical issue. And I don't think people know. On the one hand, you're absolutely right that people are going to take their own thoughts into consideration, regardless of what the law is one way or the other. They're going to act a certain way, what they believe common sense and their safety requires. On the other hand, there might well be some pent-up demand anyway that would cause people to go out. Hey, I would like to go to go buy some clothes rather than ordering them on eBay or something.
They were talking about this, Dakare, yesterday at the press conference, which is why I think these press conferences are so interesting to watch. The press was commenting on the fact that Jacksonville, Florida opened up their beaches. And yet in order to open anything up, you have to have, 2 weeks of the numbers going down of your virus, the virus. And unless you have 2 weeks of the numbers going down, you're not supposed to open anything. So they were complaining that Jacksonville, Florida had been opened. And Dr. Birx said, well, I went back and looked at all these health sites and whatnot. And the area of Jacksonville has only had, I'm not giving exact numbers here, but 20 cases. You know, it's very, the cases are very small and they meet the requirements right there in Jacksonville, Florida. So it was okay that they opened their beach. And then they asked about South Carolina, Dakare, and they said, well, wait a minute, Charleston, they're opening up everything. And have they had the 2 weeks that have gone down? And are they breaking this requirement? And once again, it's really interesting to me, the difference between requirements and laws, these kind of vague things that the federal government's saying. We suggest. You know, I don't know. How do you enact governance if you suggest and you don't make something a law? I'm still confused about that. We could talk about that forever. But anyway, South Carolina supposedly is opening. And she said, well, until we go look at the numbers of I think it's Charleston, right? You're specifically talking about Charleston. Yeah. And unless we look at the numbers in Charleston and see what their specific numbers are, I can't really make I can't make a statement about that. So I think it's going to be interesting to see if Charleston's numbers have actually gone down, or if they haven't. And if they haven't gone down, what are they doing opening? So we're kind of back full circle where I get really confused, whereas everyone's suggesting everything, but if they don't really make things laws, I don't know what. It's confusing. Oh, you know, you see what I'm saying? Professor Knipprath is just a little confusing.
If it doesn't have a penalty, it's not a law in the sense that it is commonly understood. There's a movie, Pirates of the Caribbean, where one of the bad guys says it's not exactly a law, it's more of a guideline. And that's really what we're talking about here. It's more of a guideline, unless it has a penalty.
It's going to be really interesting to see. It's going to be interesting to see, in closing here, how we fare in America. What I've been saying to my daughter and everyone on this panel here all along is I've been saying it's going to be interesting to see how America does with this disease. In China, they could shut everybody up, and they're also not telling us the true statistics. But because they're a communist society, they could just lock people in their homes. And I thought, well, the numbers may actually, even though they're much higher than they're saying, may be lower than what we end up having, because we want our freedoms and we want to go out. And the disease may spread more. So it'll just be interesting to see how this happens. But let's give a round of applause to Professor Knipprath.
Well, thank you. My pleasure.
We all wish we could be with you longer. I know Tova had more questions. I know Cathy had more questions. But thank you for explaining things to me over and over too, Professor Knipprath.
Oh, my pleasure. Hope to see you again soon.
So thank you, Professor Knipprath, once again for your brilliance. Thank you. Thank you.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
Okay. Bye, everyone. Thanks.